First and foremost, thanks so much to the organizers for putting together such a super interesting program and for giving me a chance to speak about something that's which I think is a very, very important question that's facing the Indian education system right now. That is the medium of instruction policy. So basically the question of what language should we be using in terms of thinking about acting as a medium of instruction in our schools today. A topic that I've been working on for the past 8 years or so. To start off, what I would like to do is to basically show you, just a second. Yeah, so what I'd like to show you is this world map. What this world map is basically showing you is how different is the official language. By official language, I mean the principal language of administration, for us principally of education, government and law, in a country from the languages that are spoken on a day-to-day basis, basically the spoken tongues. What you observe is a very clear pattern. So redder the color means farther the distance to the official language. So you can see large parts of sub-Saharan Africa are very, very red. They post-independence starting in the 1960s primarily retained the former colonial language, English, French, or Portuguese, to act as the principal language of society for all activities in the formal domain. So education, administration, law, the indigenous languages, which had mainly an oral tradition till date, the orthography does not remain very developed or standardized. In middle are these countries which are in orange, for instance, countries like India, where indigenous languages have been given an important role in society. But for instance, in the context of India, one important reason being linguistic diversity, we've had English also having been retained as a link language, acting as the language of higher education and social prestige in the country. Then are all these green areas on the map. Looking at the post-colonial world is basically the belt in the Southeast Asian part of the world. So Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, which was never a colony, South Korea. These are all countries which at independence did not retain the former colonial language. The indigenous languages play the role of education, administration, and law in the country. And then, of course, is the industrialized world, and in principle Europe, where countries of all sizes, from the smallest ones such as Slovenia, Slovakia, Czech Republic, a Sweden, a Denmark, a Norway, all use the major indigenous language, which is not a global language, but is spoken on a day-to-day basis to act as the principal language of education, including higher education, administration, government, and law. Okay. So basically, of course, you can see, putting aside all concerns of culture, heritage, self-respect, and thinking about it from a very narrow perspective, you could ask, well, what is the benefits of retaining English? Of course, the benefits that we often hear the proponents of states such as Karnataka or Telangana, which wanted to switch to using English as the medium of instruction right from primary schooling, is that it brings these benefits of being connected to the global labor markets, the global knowledge markets, the global trade markets. Of course, it's important to keep in mind that these are only going to arise if individuals are able to form human capital using the non-indigenous language. Okay. On the other hand, of course, are the people who have been contesting this move to introduce English as a medium of instruction, and the concerns primarily arise from the fact that it's going to increase the cost of participation in the economy, especially of human capital formation, knowledge acquisition and production, information transmission, and political participation. Why was this whole winded story? Is basically you can see that this is the key debate in terms of economics, what is the returns versus what are the costs. At the same time, there are these multiplicity of choices. As a starting point, of course, we can ask, just correlationally, what is the pattern we observe? Is it the case that the benefits have outweighed the costs? So for instance, thinking about the previous map, you should expect countries which, like sub-Saharan Africa, which are very much in the red, who have given an exclusive role to world languages, do much better off, or are the costs very high? So in the next graph, what am I basically showing you is basically correlations between 4 important outcomes we might care about: test scores in international assessments, life expectancy, what is the GDP per capita, and what is the productivity per worker, which is basically measured by log output per worker. And the pattern that we see is exactly the contrary, in the sense that countries which end up using a global language which is not widely spoken tends to have lower test scores, lower life expectancy, consequently lower amount of prosperity as measured by per capita income, or also as measured by productivity. It's important to make clear at this point that my objective is not to say that the knowledge of the global language might not be important. And this leads me to the next point, to talk about what has been called in the literature as the maximum exposure fallacy. So what here I'm showing you is self-reported. So basically based on surveys where individuals were asked, do you speak that particular language? So a randomly selected set of sub-Saharan African countries from the Afrobarometer, which basically asked people, do you speak that language or not? Then for India, from the Indian Human Development Survey, and for a set of Scandinavian countries and Slovenia from the Eurobarometer. The picture that seems to kind of emerge from this that seems to suggest is that countries which have dependent on using the colonial language since the last 60 years, so all of sub-Saharan Africa as the primary language of education, of government, of all kinds of formal domains, don't seem to be doing better, whereas countries which teach them using them as a second language seem to have greater amount of proficiency. This is not to say that several other important factors don't underlie it, but this is what has been called in the linguistic literature or in the pedagogical literature that the best way to impart skills in the second language might not be necessarily through using it as a medium of instruction. So we could ask the question, what kind of other further evidence do we have? In the interest of time, I can just say that based on policy changes, where access to mother tongue was extended, from 3 different contexts that I know of, a study in Ethiopia of mine, previously published in 2017, a very interesting paper by Tarun Jain, published in 2017, and in the context of South Africa by Catherine Erickson, all of them show that access to mother tongue instruction or access to indigenous language instruction increased literacy, English skills, graduation rates, as well as wages. There are other studies from Cameroon, from South Africa, also looking at immigrant experiences of kids in the UK and the US. Okay, so the picture here seems to suggest that use of a non-indigenous language, which is not widely known in society, especially where teachers themselves are not available who possess sufficient skills in this language, can impose a very high cost on human capital formation for a large majority of the non-elite population. So what about the picture on returns? And here there is kind of a mixed picture. So on one hand, you have a study from Angrist and Lavie who find that when Morocco switched from using French to Arabic as the medium of instruction in secondary schooling, the returns to education went down in terms of proficiency in being able to write French went down, and consequently labor market returns went down in Morocco. In the context of South Africa, Levinson finds that returns to English speaking in South Africa after apartheid, when South Africa again became reintegrated with the global economy, the premium actually fell slightly for coloreds and for blacks. In the context of Puerto Rico, Angrist, Chin, and Godet find that switching the medium of instruction from English to Spanish had no impact on English-speaking proficiency. Finally, a very important study in the context of India, because there are not so many studies which estimate returns to English, find that wages are on an average, this is based on data from the Indian Human Development Survey, that are on an average 34% and 13% higher for men who speak fluent and a little English respectively. But however, it's important to keep in mind that they are not able to resolve the question of whether these are purely returns to English or there's kind of selection. People who speak English might have much higher human capital. In line with this, so as they admit, they cannot convincingly account for ability differences among people. Surprisingly, the returns to English are similar in rural and urban areas in the data, and they're also similar in places with and without information technology offices. So they rationalize this by saying supplies and demand result in equalizing wages across regions, but that remains important questions to be asked about whether returns to English are so high or returns to human capital are so high. So finally, I would just like to take a couple of more minutes and then ask the question of, what's the way forward in some sense? At some level, a bulk of data, especially the experience of sub-Saharan Africa, suggests that reliance on non-indigenous languages can result in large-scale education failures, especially as there are not enough teachers with skills in the medium of instruction. Okay, so there are data from World Bank, which basically looks at the service development delivery indicators, which looks at, for instance, language proficiency of teachers in sub-Saharan Africa in the medium of instruction, and finds that teachers are shockingly very less proficient in these in the medium of instruction, basically the formal colonial languages. So the point is that the labor market returns that the proponents of the use of global languages are wanting might fail to materialize because people fail to garner the necessary skills in this medium of instruction. Moreover, and more importantly also, is the experience of the industrialized world and evidence from South Africa, Puerto Rico, etc., seem to suggest that using the global languages as the medium of instruction is not necessarily the best way to impart knowledge of the global language. Okay, so what is the need for the hour? I would argue that the need for the hour is that we need high quality studies that compare using English as a medium of instruction versus English as a subject to understand, what is the impact of these two choices on English skills and other learning outcomes before large-scale policy changes can be implemented. Finally, in the question, coming back to the question of, in some sense, very broadly speaking, how do we try and incentivize investment and valorization of indigenous languages? Because at the end of the day, knowledge is knowledge transmitted in whatever language it might be. And this is something that I've suggested in an article of mine before, in a newspaper article, that maybe one thing to think about is to ensure that, for instance, no matter what medium of instruction private schools offer, at the end of the 12th class board exams, people have to take at least 2 exams in a language, an indigenous language of their own choice. And maybe this will result in the necessary incentives to invest in these languages. And consequently, once you invest, will result in creating the valorization for these languages to understand that language is just a medium of transmission rather than there being an inherent hierarchy between any language being superior to the other. So with that said, Manasi, I'm sorry, I'm very happy to take questions if there are any. I think my email address is also available. I'm also happy to answer any questions that people might want to, might not have time to, I might not have time to address. So with that said, thanks so much for the invitation again.